Hi, I'm Emily. I'm delighted to be sat here with Jess Phillips, who's Labour MP and Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. So thank you very much for giving me some of your time today. So some of you might know I'm committed to fundraising for Refuge next year. I've got a target of £4,000. I'm almost at 1,400 at the moment, but also part of my fundraising, it's important to me to be kind of raising awareness of the issue of domestic abuse in the UK. So Jess is just kind of joining us today to kind of let us know a little bit about the extent of the issue, how COVID's affected that, and what we can do moving forwards.
So it's very difficult to know the extent of domestic abuse for all sorts of reasons that it gets hidden. But just to give a sort of idea, there is viewed to be 2.3 million victims of domestic abuse in the country at the moment, but that would be the case at any one time. And at least 875,000 children living with quite brutal domestic abuse, as well as rates of sexual violence and child abuse that goes along with that.
Mm-hmm.
But during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw huge rises in the number of call-outs to specialist services. The line that was run by Refuge, as well as online facilities by various different women's organisations such as Women's Aid and South All Black Sisters, IMCAN, Gallup for LGBT victims. They all saw massive increases, sometimes up to 400% increase in the number of cases coming forward through the helplines. The police similarly saw an increase. To put domestic abuse into perspective with regards to those who go to the police, and in my experience of working with victims of violence, that is a tiny fraction of the people who are suffering abuse and violence, but it still is at least a quarter of all call-outs to the police are domestic abuse related. So as a single crime type, it is the largest reason that the police are called. And so you get a sense of the massive scale that if nearly a quarter of all police call-outs in our country, that will be hundreds, thousands every day. That will give you a sense of the scale of it. Organisations like Refuge and all specialist domestic abuse services are vital for a number of reasons, some of which are obvious, offering literally refuge and community-based support services to victims to enable them to be free. But also they play an enormous part in the policy making and the policy building to try and improve police responses, housing responses, welfare responses, and how our laws work for those victims. So the work of charities like those organisations throughout the pandemic, like Refuge, they doubled, if not tripled, their workload with regard to contact with people, but they also were working tirelessly to advocate for better funding for those services. They were also working very hard on the domestic abuse bill and will now go on to working on the strategy that comes off the back of that. And it takes a massive toll, an emotional toll on organisations, and the amount of work that they have to do just to get their voices heard.
Yeah, I think that's, like you said, sort of aware of kind of rough numbers, but obviously not everyone goes to the police. And I think that's really hit home as well as I've kind of been promoting my fundraising. Just even within my social network, the amount of women that have reached out to me and said, Refuge saved my mum's life, like this is an issue that's affected me. It's obviously big, but it's the unspoken level of it. It's that we really don't have a full understanding of it because so many people aren't coming forward. And like you say, charities like Refuge, particularly now when they've seen such an uplift in kind of need for their services, and also at a time when fundraising's been made really difficult, I think that's sort of what's really motivated me to kind of do something now.
Fundraising for organisations outside of the NHS and the initial COVID response have been really, really, really difficult, and it's been a really, really challenging year for people who were already challenged for all sorts of reasons.
You sort of touched on the domestic abuse bill, so obviously that's kind of pushed forward some of some issues that kind of weren't covered before, so things like threatening to share intimate images, but there's still some quite big gaps in that bill, aren't there? Can you can you tell me a little bit about some of that?
Yeah, so some of the main gaps in the bill, one of them, the biggest gap, arguably, that cuts across all victim types of domestic violence, is the lack of a statutory duty for community-based services. So we managed to win the battle that there had to be a statutory service made of refuge and housing provision. So every local authority area now will, for the first time, legally have to provide a series of bed spaces, which we will go on to argue need to be specialist bed spaces for organisations like Refuge to manage. But what the reality is that only 30% of victims of domestic violence ever seek help through a refuge. The vast majority, 70%, are supported by community support, floating support, housing support, emotional support within their communities. And that's when you look at the rates of children accessing support, that is even higher. And we managed to get the government to commit to looking at the possibility of a statutory duty that all councils have to, and police and crime commissioners and every commissioning body has to provide community-based support. But I'm afraid to say they pushed back on it going into the bill. So that is one big gap which we will continue to push forward with. But the other larger gaps that affect more specialist groups within the main group of victims of domestic violence I would say mainly fall around migrant women, women with no recourse to public funds, women living completely legally in our country, as students working in our care sector, working completely legally on certain sorts of visas, would have what we would call no recourse to public funds. And that would mean that almost all refuge accommodation is based on access to housing benefits, and they would not have access to the housing benefit that would allow them to stay in refuge accommodation. Which means that and I've met lots of migrant women across the country who were basically told, there's nowhere for you, you're going to have to return to your perpetrator or go on the streets. And the government has failed in the domestic abuse bill to recognise that when a victim comes forward in our country, likely to have been abused by a British citizen, that we have a duty of care and responsibility to ensure that they can access safe accommodation from a place like Refuge, who could never afford to be funding these organisations without those systems properly in place. And so we've seen the turning away of migrant women, and unfortunately that leads to, in the worst cases, their murder, but in most cases that I come across, just going back to allowing a crime to persist. The police hold their hands up and say this is unsustainable. The sector have argued the case. However, the bill leaves an enormous gap there. The other group that I think that have been ill served by the bill is disabled victims of domestic abuse. The statistics show us that disabled people are more likely to become victims of domestic abuse than less, and yet the bill fails to recognise the relationships between a carer, how they might not be in an intimate relationship or even a familial relationship with a carer, but that those coercions that are absolutely the hallmark of domestic abuse can be exactly the same. And that was largely missed in the bill, and I think that makes it's poorer for it.
Yeah, I think those are some quite big gaps that we're still seeing there. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Migrant victim who wants community-based support.
Yeah,
good luck.
not there. Yeah. I think just with that in mind, kind of if people are watching and they've sort of seen how this issue has been highlighted over the last year and exacerbated in some ways, and they want to help, they want to do something, what can we do, sort of, other than kind of fundraising? What can we be doing to kind of push these issues into government?
I mean, there's two things that ordinary people can do beyond sort of fundraising. One is advocacy on a national stage. Write to your members of parliament, write to your local council, write to your police and crime commissioner, because the reality is that if I were to go to my local police tasking meeting in Yardley this week, the vast majority of cases that would be raised with the policing team that set the priorities for the local area will be issues around, you know, motorcycles on the road, antisocial behaviour, all really, really important issues that make neighbourhoods, but no one ever mentions violence against women and girls. I receive 10 times the amount of lobbying emails about bees than I do about women. And maybe that's skewed in my case because I think my constituents probably are quite aware that they don't need to lobby me to be arguing for these particular concerns, but I can almost guarantee you that bees have considerably more. I'm not saying that I don't like bees. I do just like women better. And you know, call me picky. But you know, we only make this a political priority when it's a political priority for voters. And after during the pandemic and after the murder of Sarah Everard, that became the case. It became a political priority for the country, but we have to maintain that, and that takes serious, like, you know, foot on the pedal. The other thing that ordinary citizens can do to make this better is make it better in your own life. Ask questions of people, make yourself available for people to talk to you about it, because as you were saying, like when you said you were going out and fundraising, people were coming forward to you and saying, oh, this has happened to me. And that isn't, there's a common misconception about domestic abuse that it is hard to come forward for people, that it's hard to say, and there's an element of truth in that, about the shame that those people are made to feel. However, I have never found it difficult for people to come forward to me about domestic abuse. A woman told me about her rape at the checkout in Tesco's one time, and the reality of that is because I make myself, I make it clear publicly that I care about this. So when you made it clear publicly that you cared about this, saying that you were going to do this fundraising for Refuge, people who never told you this before told you this now. And so it's on all of us to make ourselves available to the people in our lives by showing that when people say things wrong about domestic abuse, or say off-colour things about women, that we point out that we don't like it. I tell you now that people will be coming forward to you. If you make it clear that you can hear people, they will come and ask for help. And you don't need to know all the answers. People are worried, like, well, I won't know what to do. Most people just want someone to listen to them. And so it's on all of us, in our workplaces, in our friendship groups, in our neighbourhoods, to make it so that it isn't shameful to come forward about domestic abuse. And there's a job of work for us to do, but we can only do it if everybody does it.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I think, yeah, I hadn't really thought about it like that. Just making yourself
It's a bit
feel
like,
like,
you know, the LGBT lanyards that you get in like the NHS.
yeah.
And that makes people who are LGBT, when they go to the doctors, feel that they can tell the truth about themselves. Just that little visual, I'm
Yeah.
open for this conversation.
Yeah.
There's an element of that about it. There is an element of just making your spaces safe for people. And you don't need to ask people if you suspect that they're being bashed about at home or coerced or financially controlled. You don't need to be like, is your husband, you don't need to be like, is it this, is it this? Just say, is everything all right at home? Because people need permission to speak, especially people who've been coerced, to ask permission for everything. So you need to give people permission to come forward, and everybody can do better at that.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think that's probably a really nice point to leave it on. You know, there's definitely a lot there for people to think about and hopefully take away. So no, thank you so much for your time. That's been really helpful. I think, like you say, it is it's a really important issue. It's part of a wider set of issues, and we all just need to kind of be pushing it forward. So no, thank you so much for your time, Jess.
Well done to you for trekking very far.
Thank you. No, thank you so much.
No worries, my pleasure.
I will let you get on. Great. Thanks so much, Jess.